The storm didn't begin with thunder. It began with silence. In the heart of a small town called Maple Hollow, the morning air felt heavier than usual, thick with humidity and something unspoken. The streets were mostly empty, except for an old pickup humming past shuttered stores and a flickering streetlight that refused to die. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew when to look away. Inside a corner diner painted in fading blue letters that read Grace's Table, a woman stood alone clutching a coffee pot like it was armor. Grace Miller, mid-30s, steady hands, tired eyes, had owned the place since her mother passed 2 years ago. Every morning she came in before dawn, turned on the lights, and whispered a quiet prayer to the cracked floor tiles. Let today be kind. But kindness had been hard to find in Maple Hollow lately. She filled the air with the scent of fresh coffee, the only thing that seemed to hold the place together. The walls were lined with framed photos, smiling faces from better years back when the diner buzzed with laughter. Now only one regular came, Tom Jenkins, a retired trucker who never said more than 2 words. Grace watched him eat in silence, spoon clinking against his cup. It wasn't unfriendly, just hollow, the silence of a town that had already made up its mind about her. Grace's diner wasn't just struggling, it was dying. The factory that kept the town alive had closed last winter, and with it went the last of the steady paychecks. But even before that, something colder had spread through Maple Hollow. The kind of quiet prejudice that smiled in public and whispered in private. Grace didn't fit here. Maybe she never did. Her mother had been the only black woman to own a business in town, and Grace had inherited both the diner and the resistance that came with it. Still, she held her ground. Every chair polished, every napkin folded, every day the door unlocked at 6 sharp. Because this diner was her mother's dream, and dreams deserved defenders. That morning, Grace moved to wipe the window when she saw it again. A fresh smear of mud shaped into 2 crude words. Go home. She stared for a long moment, chest tight, breath shallow. No surprise, no anger, just that same ache that had settled in her bones months ago. Then she grabbed a towel and wiped it away, same as she always did, because that's what she'd learned from her mother. You clean what you can. You face what you can't. The bell above the door jingled, breaking the stillness. Grace looked up automatically, forcing a small smile, but froze. A man stood in the doorway, shoulders wide beneath a black leather jacket, his beard silver at the edges. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that didn't come from a bad night's sleep but from too many hard years. His jacket carried a worn insignia, a winged skull framed by flames. It was unmistakable, a Raven Rider's patch. Every diner in the South had a story about them. Bikers who rode in packs, left chaos in their wake, and disappeared before dawn. Folks in Maple Hollow whispered that the Riders had burned down a bar 2 towns over. No one really knew, but everyone was afraid. Grace's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. She watched him walk slowly toward the counter, each step measured, deliberate. He sat down at the stool closest to the window, close to the exit, she noticed, and placed a trembling hand on the counter. His knuckles were scarred, the skin rough like weathered leather. Morning, Grace said softly, breaking the silence. He nodded once, voice low. Coffee, black. She poured without a word, and the smell filled the space between them. When she slid the cup toward him, she noticed the faint hospital tag still clinging to his wrist. His hand shook slightly as he lifted the mug, his breath catching before he took the first sip. You all right? She asked finally, her tone more gentle than cautious. He hesitated. My daughter's in the hospital down the road, he said quietly. They said it's stage 4. I just needed somewhere. Not sterile. Grace felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry, she murmured. He nodded, eyes fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. Name's Luke Carter, he said after a moment. Grace Miller, she replied, offering a faint smile. You're welcome here, Luke. He gave a quiet laugh, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Not everyone in this town feels that way. Grace tilted her head. Then maybe they should spend more time here. He looked at her for the first time, really looked, and something softened in his expression. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. I don't want to bring trouble to your door, he said. Grace's voice was steady. If kindness brings trouble, I'll take it. Outside, the sky had turned gray. A storm was coming, and the town didn't know it yet. Because that one simple act, a black diner owner serving coffee to a man in a biker vest, was about to shake Maple Hollow in ways no one could have imagined. The next morning came with a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that carries a warning before the thunder breaks. Grace opened the diner at sunrise as she always did, her movements automatic, but her thoughts were tangled. She kept thinking about the man from yesterday, the biker with tired eyes and a voice full of hurt. Luke Carter, the kind of man you could tell had seen the world's rough edges and was still standing somehow. The townsfolk had seen him too. And in Maple Hollow, word spread faster than fire. By 8 o'clock, Grace noticed the first stairs. 2 women from the church stood across the street, pretending to admire the window display at the florist's shop, whispering behind cupped hands. Then the hardware store owner, Bill Hanley, passed by twice, pretending to sweep the front steps, though he hadn't sold a single nail in weeks. Their looks said everything. They'd seen the leather jacket. They knew the patch. And to them, that was enough to make Grace guilty too. The bell above the door rang sharply. Grace looked up and her stomach dropped. 2 police officers stepped inside. The first one was Officer Randall Briggs, a tall man with a square jaw and a temper that never needed much invitation. Behind him was Deputy Claire Moore, younger, quiet, the kind who followed orders before her conscience. Randall's boots hit the floor like a warning. He took in the diner with a long, slow glance, his eyes landing on Grace behind the counter. "Morning," he said, but the word came out like a test, not a greeting. "Morning," Grace replied evenly, keeping her voice steady. Randall's gaze drifted to the stool by the window. Empty now, but yesterday's ghost still sat there in his memory. "Heard you had yourself a visitor," he said, tone casual, though his smirk gave him away. "One of them Raven Riders." Grace met his eyes. "He ordered coffee," she said simply. "Coffee," Randall repeated with a chuckle. "That all? Last I checked, serving coffee wasn't a crime." Deputy Moore shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them but said nothing. Randall leaned forward on the counter, close enough for Grace to smell the faint mix of aftershave and arrogance. "You ought to be careful who you welcome into your place, Grace. People talk. Folks don't take kindly to troublemakers." Grace didn't flinch. "And maybe folks ought to learn the difference between trouble and decency." Randall's smirk faded. "You calling me indecent?" "I'm saying you're in my diner," she replied, voice quiet but sharp. "And I don't allow intimidation with the breakfast special." The silence that followed was tight enough to cut. Deputy Moore shifted again, looking like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Randall finally straightened, jaw tight. "You think that biker's gonna come back?" Grace crossed her arms. "He's welcome if he does." Randall's eyes darkened. "You'd protect him, would you? One of them felons?" "I'd protect anyone who walks through that door without raising a hand to me," she said. "Because that's what this place is for." For a moment, no one breathed. Then Randall stepped back, nostrils flaring. "You just remember," he said, low and cold, "this town's got rules. And people like you ain't the ones who make them." He turned sharply, knocking the salt shaker off the counter with his sleeve. It shattered on the floor, spilling white crystals like snow. He didn't apologize. Didn't look back. Just pushed through the door and out into the street. Deputy Moore lingered. Her eyes met Grace's. There was something flickering there. Shame, maybe, or the first hint of doubt. She whispered almost too softly to hear, "I'm sorry." Then she followed Randall out. Grace stood still, her breath shallow. The silence that filled the diner after they left was heavier than before, pressing against the windows, clinging to the air. She looked down at the broken salt, crouched, and began to sweep it up, one slow stroke at a time. Outside, the town kept moving as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted. Something small but irreversible. By evening, when Grace walked home, the eyes followed her. The grocer who once offered her extra bread looked away. The mailman waved half-heartedly, then turned to his truck. She passed by the church, its steeple tall against the fading sun, and saw a new sign posted on the board. Community values matter. Choose who you stand with. She didn't stop walking. She just whispered to herself, "I already did." That night she couldn't sleep. The diner's neon sign flickered faintly outside her window, painting her ceiling in restless red light. She thought about her mother, about the lessons she used to repeat. The world will test your kindness, baby. It'll see how much you can take before you break. Don't let it win. Grace turned on her side, eyes open, heart pounding. She didn't know yet that the real test was coming, that the town wasn't finished punishing her, and that far across the river, in a quiet hospital room, Luke Carter was staring at his daughter's pale face and promising himself that no one who stood up for him would stand alone for long. The next morning, Grace found something nailed to her diner door, a piece of cardboard with red paint dripping down its edges like blood. No traitors, no bikers, no exceptions. She didn't cry. She didn't curse. She just pulled the board off, dropped it in the trash, and unlocked the door, because some people fought their battles with fists. Grace Miller fought hers with coffee and open doors. She turned the sign to open, brewed a fresh pot and waited, and somewhere down the highway, a dozen engines roared to life. The day crawled forward like a wounded thing. No one came into the diner, not one person. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the ceiling fan that wobbled every few seconds like it was thinking of giving up. Grace sat at the counter, elbows on the wood, her chin resting on folded hands. She had already cleaned the same coffee machine twice, polished every glass, refilled every salt shaker, anything to keep from thinking. By noon, her stomach felt hollow. Not from hunger, but from the silence. She made herself a cup of coffee anyway. The heat of the mug steadied her, reminded her she was still here. Still fighting. Outside, the street was empty. A tumble of leaves drifted past, caught in the wind that smelled faintly of rain. She thought of her mother again, of how she used to hum old gospel tunes while flipping pancakes, the kind that made the air feel safe. Grace whispered one under her breath, so soft it was barely a sound. Then something hit the window, a wet thud. Then another. Then another. Grace jumped to her feet. She turned toward the glass and her breath caught eggs, dozens of them. Cracking, dripping down the window in yellow streaks. Then came tomatoes, hitting harder, bursting against the frame, splattering the floor in red pulp. She could hear laughter outside. Teenage voices, a truck revving away, tires squealing, then silence again. She walked to the window slowly, the way you approach a wild animal. The mess dripped down in uneven lines. Someone had scrawled something across the bottom in the gooey mixture of yolk and tomato. Go back. For a moment, Grace just stood there, hand over her mouth. Not crying, not angry, just tired. So tired, she reached for a rag and began wiping the window, pushing away the slime until her reflection came back into focus. Her eyes were steady, her jaw tight. When the glass was clean again, she said quietly, "Not leaving." Hours passed. No customers, no calls. The diner stayed quiet except for the occasional rumble of a passing truck that never stopped. The sun fell behind the trees and the neon sign outside buzzed faintly in the growing dark. At 8 o'clock, Grace turned off the open sign and sat at her mother's old booth by the corner window. She pulled out a notebook, the one she used to keep track of bills. The pages were lined with red ink, power, rent, gas, water. Her pen hovered over the column of numbers for a long time before she finally wrote one more word at the bottom. Dignity and still mine. A faint knock on the glass startled her. She looked up and saw a woman standing outside, a small older lady in a floral dress and gray cardigan. It was Mrs. Turner, the church treasurer who'd known Grace's mother. Grace hesitated before unlocking the door. "Evening," she said quietly. Mrs. Turner didn't smile. "I won't stay," she said. "I just came to tell you that not everyone agrees with what's happening." Grace folded her arms. "You weren't here yesterday." Mrs. Turner's eyes dropped. "I was scared." Grace nodded once slowly. "So am I. But fear's a poor excuse for silence." Mrs. Turner looked ashamed. "You're right." She hesitated, then added, "I'll bring some pies tomorrow. People listen better when their mouths are full." Grace gave the smallest smile. "Maybe." Mrs. Turner turned to go. "Grace," she said before leaving, "you did the right thing. Don't forget that." When the door closed again, the silence returned, softer now but still heavy. Grace sat for a long time staring at the street. She whispered to herself, "I'm still here, and that has to count for something." Across town, in the dim glow of a hospital room, Luke Carter sat beside his daughter's bed. The machines hummed softly around them, each beep a reminder that time was running thin. His daughter Lily slept under a pale blue blanket, her small hand resting on his. Luke's eyes were fixed on the window, but his mind was far away, back at the diner, to the woman who had stood up for him without hesitation. Grace's voice echoed in his head. If kindness brings trouble, I'll take it. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in years. Ben Carter. His younger brother. Luke stared at the name for a long moment, thumb hovering over the call button. Then he pressed it. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. Luke? Damn, it's been a while. Yeah, Luke said, his voice rough. Listen, I need a favor. Ben paused. You okay? It's not for me, Luke said. It's for someone who did right by me when no one else would. She's in trouble because of it. Her name's Grace Miller. Owns a diner in Maple Hollow. Ben was quiet for a beat. Then he said, You want me to call the club? Luke shook his head even though Ben couldn't see him. No, I want you to bring them. There was silence on the line. Then a low chuckle that wasn't amusement but recognition. How bad? Bad enough that she's standing alone, Luke said. Ben's voice dropped. Then she won't be for long. Luke hung up, leaning back in his chair, his eyes glistening. Thank you, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to his brother, to fate, or to Grace herself. The next morning, Grace opened the diner like she always did, quietly, faithfully. The power had been cut during the night. The lights were dead, the coffee machine silent. She brewed a small pot on the emergency stove, poured herself a cup and sat at the counter, watching the empty street. By 9:30, she had almost convinced herself no one would come. Then she heard it, a low rumble, distant at first, then louder, the kind of sound that rolls through your chest before it reaches your ears. Grace stood, heart racing. She looked out the window. Down the main road, the horizon shimmered with motion, chrome catching sunlight, engines roaring like thunder. One bike, then 5, then 50. Within minutes, the street was filled. Men and women in leather vests, black boots, and patches that gleamed under the morning sun. They didn't stop at the edge of town. They kept coming. A river of chrome and noise and unity, rolling straight toward Grace's diner. When they finally halted, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. And that's when Grace saw him, Ben Carter, standing beside his bike, pulling off his helmet. His eyes met hers through the window, calm and resolute. He nodded once, then spoke into a small radio clipped to his vest. Now. The next second, 200 more engines roared to life across Maple Hollow. The roar of the engines filled every corner of Maple Hollow. The sound wasn't chaos, it was power, unity, something alive. The townsfolk spilled out from shops and porches, frozen in disbelief. They had never seen anything like it. Rows of motorcycles lined both sides of Main Street, each one shining under the pale morning sun. Leather jackets, steel boots, and gloved hands, all motionless now like soldiers waiting for a signal. Grace stood behind the counter, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles went white. She couldn't move, could barely breathe. Her mind raced through every possible outcome, fear, retaliation, misunderstanding, but none of them prepared her for what came next. The door swung open, the bell chiming softly against the heavy silence. Ben Carter stepped inside. His vest bore the insignia of the Raven Riders, the same patch that had brought Grace so much scorn. He was tall and broad, his beard trimmed, his eyes sharp but kind. Ms. Miller? He asked. Grace nodded slowly. Yes, I'm Ben, he said. Luke's brother. Her chest tightened. Is he? He's with his daughter. She's holding on, Ben said gently. He wanted me to tell you that what you did meant something. To him, to her, to all of us. Grace blinked hard. You didn't have to come. Ben's lips curved slightly. Ma'am, when someone stands up for one of ours, they stand up for all of us. She looked past him toward the window. The street shimmered with sunlight reflecting off metal. Hundreds of bikers waited quietly, their engines still idling low, the sound like a living heartbeat. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Ben turned toward the crowd, then back to her. We're going to fix what this town broke. He reached into his vest and pulled out a thick envelope. Luke said your power was cut, your supplies ruined. We took care of it. Grace frowned in disbelief. You what? He handed her the envelope. Inside were receipts. Electricity paid 6 months in advance, new food deliveries, even an invoice for a new coffee machine. At the bottom was a handwritten note. You fed our brother when no one else would. Now let us feed you." Her throat closed. She pressed a hand against her chest, overwhelmed. Outside, the bikers began dismounting their bikes one by one. They didn't shout or make noise. They walked quietly into the diner, filling every booth, every stool, every empty corner that had been silent for weeks. Some nodded respectfully at Grace as they passed. Others simply smiled wordlessly as if saying, "We see you." Within minutes, Grace's table was alive again. The hum of conversation replaced the silence, the clatter of plates and cups rising like music. Grace moved behind the counter automatically, pouring coffee, taking orders, refilling cups. It was instinct, the rhythm of her life restored. But what struck her most wasn't the noise. It was the kindness. These people, tattooed, scarred, wearing jackets that had once symbolized danger to the town, spoke softly, laughed gently, tipped generously. They treated her diner like sacred ground, and for the first time in months, Grace felt safe. By noon, the street outside looked like a festival. Kids who had once crossed the street to avoid her window now stood on the sidewalks, pointing at the motorcycles in awe. A few brave ones wandered closer. One boy, Jacob Hanley, the hardware store owner's son, reached up to touch a shiny red bike. Its owner, a woman with a silver braid and weathered hands, crouched beside him. "Careful, kiddo," she said with a grin. "Want to sit on it?" Jacob's eyes went wide. "Can I?" "Sure thing. Just don't twist the throttle or we'll both go flying." The boy laughed as she lifted him onto the seat, showing him how to hold the handlebars. The moment caught Grace's eye from inside and her heart squeezed. Not far away, Mrs. Turner, the same woman who had promised pies, was sitting at a booth with a biker named Linda, learning how to crochet fingerless gloves. Linda's arms were covered in tattoos, but her laugh was light and easy. Mrs. Turner was actually smiling, cheeks flushed with something that looked suspiciously like joy. Grace watched it all from behind the counter, barely daring to breathe. The town that had turned its back on her was starting, just barely, to face her again. The bell over the door rang again. Grace turned, expecting another rider. Instead, it was Deputy Claire Moore. She wasn't in uniform. No badge, no gun, no swagger, just a plain gray shirt and jeans. Her expression was uncertain, her steps careful. "Coffee?" Grace asked quietly. Claire nodded. "Black, no sugar." Grace poured, slid the mug across the counter. Their fingers brushed. "Thank you," Claire said. "For what?" "For not turning me away," Claire replied. Her voice cracked a little. "I should have said something that day. When Randall was here, I should have stopped him." Grace said nothing, waiting. "I didn't throw the eggs," Claire went on. "But I didn't stop the people who did. And that's the same thing, isn't it?" Grace looked at her for a long moment. "It's not too late to start doing better." Claire nodded, eyes glistening. Grace reached into the basket beside her and placed a biscuit on a small plate. "Eat," she said softly. "It helps the talking go down easier." A laugh, small, surprised, escaped Claire's lips. "You really are something else, Ms. Miller. Just trying to keep folks fed," Grace said. And so the afternoon rolled on, the diner alive with conversation, laughter, and something else, something new. Trust. Grace caught sight of her father's old photo hanging on the wall behind the counter, him smiling, holding a spatula like a sword, standing right where she stood now. She whispered under her breath, "You were right, Mama, people can change. Sometimes you just gotta show them how." Outside, the engines still lined Main Street like guardians. The Raven Riders had come not to intimidate but to protect. Grace didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The town's eyes were on her, and so were the riders. And soon one more person would walk through her door, the last person she ever expected to see again. The light outside was beginning to dip, painting Maple Hollow in gold and soft gray. Inside Grace's table, every seat was full. The low chatter of voices and the clinking of silverware filled the air like a song the town had forgotten it knew. Grace moved between tables, refilling coffee, laughing softly when someone told her a joke, wiping her hands on her apron. Her body was tired, but her heart was strong, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Then the bell above the door jingled, and something in the air changed. The laughter dimmed, the voices dropped, and a hush rippled through the diner. Grace turned toward the door. A tall man stood there, his vest marked with the Raven Riders insignia. But unlike the others, his was black and new, the leather gleaming. Across the back in bold white thread were the words, President Raven Riders Eastern Chapter. He stepped forward with a steady gait, the sound of his boots echoing on the tile. Beside him walked Ben Carter. Grace's pulse kicked hard in her chest. The man stopped at the center of the diner, scanning the room before his eyes found hers. They were sharp, not cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried without force, deep and calm like the rumble of a distant storm. "You must be Grace Miller." She nodded once. "I am." He reached out his hand. "Name's Dominic Reed, Luke's old friend." Grace shook his hand, her grip firm despite the tremor in her chest. Dominic glanced around the diner, then raised a hand to the crowd. The room fell into silence. He didn't need to raise his voice. "We've ridden across this state 100 times," he said. "We've been called outlaws, criminals, worse. But every now and then you find someone who reminds you that decency ain't gone from the world." His gaze found Grace again. This woman didn't ask who we were. Didn't care about the patch. She saw a man hurting and treated him like a person. "That's rarer than you think." He reached into the duffel bag Ben handed him and pulled out something folded in black. "We don't hand these out often," he said. "They have to be earned." He unfolded it slowly. A leather vest, smooth and shining with white thread stitched across the back. "Friend of the Raven Riders." And beneath it, in smaller red letters, "Protected." The diner erupted. Applause thundered against the walls, boots stomped the floor, voices cheered her name. Grace's throat tightened, her eyes stung. She couldn't move at first. Could only stare at the vest, the light catching on its newness. Dominic leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You earned this. Not with fear. With heart. That's the kind of strength this world needs more of." Grace nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Thank you," she whispered. She turned and hung the vest on the wall beside her mother's photograph. It looked right there, like it had always belonged. The applause softened into murmurs, and when Grace looked up, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. The townsfolk. They were coming in through the door, hesitant, quiet, but coming all the same. First was Joe Hanley, the hardware store owner. He took off his hat, stepped forward, and stopped in front of her. "Grace," he said, his voice rough, "I was wrong. I saw what they did to your place. I said nothing. I'm sorry." Grace looked at him, then at the others behind him. Mrs. Turner, Ruth from the church, even the mailman who had stopped waving. "Apologies don't fix everything," she said softly, "but they're a start." Joe nodded. "Then let's start." One by one they came closer, shaking her hand, offering small words. Some smiled shyly. Some cried. The barrier that had held this town frozen for years began to crack quietly, under the weight of humility. Grace's chest filled with something she hadn't dared to name in months, hope. And then, just as she thought the day couldn't bring another surprise, the bell chimed again. It was Luke. He looked different, his face still lined, his jacket still worn, but his eyes were clear, steady. When he saw her, he smiled. "I was hoping you'd still be here," he said. "I told you," she replied softly. "I don't close my doors." He stepped closer, holding something small in his hand. An envelope. "Lily wanted you to have this." Grace's hand shook slightly as she opened it. Inside was a drawing done in colored pencil. A woman behind a counter handing a steaming mug to a man in a biker jacket. Above them, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were 3 words. "Be kind anyway." Grace pressed a hand over her mouth. Luke's voice grew quiet. "The new treatment's working. She's stronger. She said the world needs more people like you." Grace couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Tell her I'll save her a seat by the window." Luke smiled, that soft, weary smile of a man who had finally found peace. "I will." He turned to leave, but paused. "Grace," he said, "she's alive because you chose kindness when you didn't have to." When the door closed behind him, the diner felt different. Not empty, not quiet, just calm, like the world had exhaled. Later that evening, as the last of the bikers prepared to leave, Grace stood behind the counter, wiping it down one last time. Outside, engines rumbled low, not in warning but in farewell. She turned to the wall where her mother's photo hung beside the new vest. The two looked right together, strength and grace side by side. She whispered, "We're still standing, Mama." Just then, the door creaked open once more. Officer Randall Briggs stepped inside. No hat, no smirk, no swagger. Just a man, tired and small. He looked at the vest, then at her. "Town's different now," he said quietly. Grace didn't answer. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. He sat down, wrapping his hands around the mug. "I saw what they did to you, to your place. I should have stopped it. I should have been better." Grace's eyes didn't soften, but her voice was calm. "Some things you can't fix with words, Randall. You have to live them different." He nodded, staring into his cup. "I intend to." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge, and placed it gently on the counter. "Taking some time off. Maybe longer. Got things I need to unlearn." She looked at the badge, then at him. "You don't need to leave town," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "But maybe I should." He stood, straightened his shoulders. "For what it's worth," he added, "I'm glad you didn't back down." Grace gave a faint smile. Didn't know how. He nodded once, then left, the bell chiming softly behind him. When the door shut, Grace turned off the lights one by one. The glow from the streetlight outside slipped through the window, catching on the vest hanging by her mother's photo. The words, "Friend of the Raven Riders, protected," shimmered faintly in the light. Grace stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the echo of voices that had filled her diner that day. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something in Maple Hollow had shifted, a little less hate, a little more courage. And as she poured herself one last cup of coffee and whispered, "Here's to tomorrow," she knew one truth would always remain. Change didn't always come in a roar. Sometimes it came in a cup of coffee, offered with steady hands and a heart that refused to turn away.